done this 3 times already at this conference, but Caitlin is tweeting this out as well.
Sure,
so
great.
I think it's going to get a lot of coverage.
I know they're chance.
You're the best.
So great.
So what? I have it. Let's see if I can do this thing. Oh, great. Yeah, just give it to me. I have to.
Today's the 8th, is that right?
I believe so. Guess we can leave these up here.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'll grab the seat next to you.
Yes, great. I'll just leave these for them. So tell me about like where you're coming from,
Oh.
because I know Frank has worked with you
Yeah.
a fair bit.
Yeah.
I love Frank. He's
Yeah,
the best.
I also love Frank, yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think
Yeah.
everybody does.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, and you're like largely mysterious on the internet, I
Oh.
assume intentionally.
Yeah, I guess so. You know, I've just never been that. I'm like, I do Twitter stuff increasingly, getting sucked into that, but otherwise,
does.
yeah, not so much. Yeah, I've just, I don't know, just been freelancing and like working through Frank at the Nation. I moved to New York pretty recently. I'm working on a book now about asylum, which is kind of
Asylum?
yeah.
Uh-huh.
Which is actually, after thinking about it more, is more along the lines of what I want to talk about today, like economic asylum, the idea of economic asylum. And I hope that doesn't throw anyone for any loops.
I don't think so.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I was gonna ask you, it's tricky since we don't have everybody.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what sort of question to lead off with, and there are a few intersections in all of your work, obviously. I mean, you and Michelle work most on sort of international questions and migrant labor and that sort of thing. And Bryce has done a little bit less of that, although she does write about that, and a little bit
Some
more
labor,
on
domestic labor stuff. Yeah.
totally,
Yeah.
and especially gender.
Yeah.
Of course, gender intersects very strongly with work both you and Michelle have done, detention centers, visa questions. So, I mean, the framing of the whole conference, I believe, is around borders, but like borders loosely conceived.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can ask, something about how, like, I can ask something like how borders figure in your work, or how, like, borders shape how you write about war,
Yeah.
specifically. Like,
Hello.
how you write about labor. Hey, how are you? Great to see you.
Sorry, I'm putting it like kind of down to the wire, but
That is fine.
got
You actually beat Michelle.
Oh, yeah.
She might get here closer to 2. She's in a cab.
I've been in that position.
Yes, it's
and
not
Yeah.
fun.
I feel badly and do not envy her at all.
But she will leap up onto the stage when she gets here.
Great.
So.
Yeah.
With her insight.
Big grand entrance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right.
Hi, Michelle. So glad you're here. Yes.
So you're leaving the Nation.
I have left.
You have left. Yeah.
I'm the executive editor of The Appeal now, which is a brand new criminal justice reporting outlet.
Oh, great.
We're sort of focused on the county level, like county prosecutors, sheriffs, like, which is shit that like does not get covered, but is actually where all incarceration happens almost.
Yeah. Yeah. That's terrific.
Yeah, it's
so
really fun.
The
You
New
should
York,
pitch us.
New York focus.
No,
Yeah.
it's national.
Yeah. Oh. Cool.
We have people
So,
all
like,
over the
yeah.
country, and we're, I mean, Frank knows all about this too, but because it's a nonprofit project and it's new, we actually really like to co-publish. Like, we can put money behind the work that people are doing,
Yeah.
but then we would prefer that it see a larger audience.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So, excuse me, did you sign these?
Yeah. We put them up.
we did.
I think. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about like the opening question,
Yeah.
which I'll keep fairly general so that you guys can talk about what most interests you, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Cool.
So there are like a couple angles I could take. Like, I think of the three of you, your work is like a little less like literally border focused,
Yes.
although you do hit on that.
Right.
So given that it's the two of you, I'm trying to think of like the best thing that will apply to both of
Your
you.
view is like an immigration order.
Yeah. Typically.
I mean,
Yeah.
to boil it down.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
I could go really broad, like say something like, how has like the changing nature of work arrangements like shaped the kind of reporting that you do? And that would allow each of you to talk about what you want to talk about.
Yeah.
Or I could say something like, you know, how has, you know, the changing nature of like borders and human movement
Right.
like shaped the work that you do and what you're covering right now. Like, do you guys have like anything that would like help you lead in with what you most want to talk about?
I feel like maybe for me, probably the first question is a little easier because I can talk about sort of like movements and borders, but for me it's much more like metaphorical, like cross-class
Yeah.
movement building and things like that, less
Yeah.
like literally crossing borders. But I'm happy to also just like let you talk about immigration more concretely and then
Yeah.
And I could use like globalization as a frame. That would be another way to do it. Just say like, you know, how have the, you know, sort of like shifting and contingent work arrangements, born of globalization, affected the writing that you do about work? And like everyone knows that that's like a massively broad question, and
Yeah.
you're going to talk about what you're most
Yeah.
interested in right now, and then we can get more specific.
Yeah. Yeah. That all sounds good.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Because there are so many good tie-ins between everyone's work here. Like everybody here writes about like how women are affected by migration, visas, work arrangements. Like that's in everyone's work. And I think like what I want to work up to like more towards the end of the conversation is like what are the structures that allow like unlikely coalitions to work?
yeah. Yeah.
Because like everyone's talking about like you're talking about strikes where there are not usually strikes.
Right.
You're talking about like labor advocacy in the face of like undocumented status,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
So we sort of work up to not the solution, but like the solution-y structure.
If we could get there, that would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you can solve it, that would be good. But
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Are you a Nation writer?
Not officially.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
write stories for
But
the
I got
nation.
I got a donation under my name right now, which is cool. Yeah.
I'm sure I've read some of your stories.
Oh yeah. Maybe. Yeah. And yeah, mostly. Well, I do like some prison stuff
Oh, okay.
for them, like cover the prison strikes, but mostly it's
Oh, then I have read you.
Yeah.
Okay.
mostly it's immigration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been starting to cover the prison strikes actually
For this summer?
the appeal.
Oh yeah.
I just had a piece of about what's going on inside Angola.
For the upcoming like summer, July, August strikes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I really like
Well, there
covered.
was like a spontaneous one in Angola that
Yeah.
caught my attention.
Yeah. Yeah, I covered it pretty closely in September 2016,
Yeah.
and then I've like maintained a lot of those contacts, and they're all like starting to ping me again.
Yeah.
Be like there's a lot of movement, but I'm gonna be gone this summer for 2 months, and
Oh,
so
no.
yeah, I don't think I'm gonna be able to cover it all. But I passed along a couple of contacts to Frank Reynolds
Oh, nice.
that
Okay.
hopefully someone else can pick up.
Yeah,
I mean, they're obviously doing all their own great work.
I should actually, I should get back. I'm not as deeply sourced in there. I've been sort of, I did not cover the one in 2016, but I had a colleague where I was working at the time who was doing that.
Yeah. Where were you?
I was at Think Progress. So I don't know if you know Karina Towns. She's now at the appeal. But she covered that. So I've been covering more of the like one-off-ones
Yeah.
since, but each time finding new people along the way. So
Yeah,
I should
yeah.
get back in touch with them.
Yeah.
It seems like it's coming up. I find it really
I know. Yep. I mean, it seems like the repercussions are as bad or worse in some locations, but the capacity, like the means that they have now, just for the self-defense, is like really, it's like one of the biggest changes.
Two prisoners in Angola.
Yeah.
This is wild.
Yeah.
They were able to just
Yeah, I
have
know.
like on their terms, on
Yep.
their time.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Have what they
Yeah.
want. I'm sure. Yeah, and social media, like those things.
Yeah.
Okay. I feel like organizing generally, like people talk about the impact of social media in our lives. I think a lot of times it's also like when you're organizing,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is really, it's like the cooler side of
Yeah.
Facebook
Yeah.
dominating our lives.
Yeah, like there's occasional like short videos from inside the things that
Yeah.
get out, and it's incredible.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, good afternoon. It's been a pretty amazing 2 days so far. A lot of really interesting things happening here at the conference. We are really pleased to have this plenary session scheduled for this year's conference. I just want to give a backstory to how this was formed. The WCSA started advertising in the nation about a year ago. We wanted to create ads to promote our annual conferences with the hopes of increasing membership. And I worked closely with Tim Johnson, Associate Publisher of Advertising, and we designed a campaign, and he was surprised to learn about the WCSA. He didn't know we existed. And we started having a conversation, and I said, well, several nation journalists have won Studs Terkel Awards from the WCSA, and he didn't know that. So from there, the idea for this plenary was formed. And I think that's an interesting story because then he introduced me to Caitlin Graff, the Vice President for Communications of the nation, and I'm really grateful for her suggesting these journalists to come here today to speak to us. So I'm really thankful that you're here. You made the trek out from New York. We have one more person coming. Trains maybe don't work as we want them to. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sarah Leonard, who is our moderator. She's executive editor of criminal justice publication The Appeal and a contributing editor to The Nation. So this is The Nation Presents The Future of Labor.
Mikhail, do you want to give me the speaker's bias? I know these speakers pretty well, but not well enough to do it by memory, so I'm going to give them a proper introduction. We're really thrilled to be here, and thank you for having us. The conference seems really incredible, and it's great to be included in an organization like this for us coming from the journalism world. So I'm going to do a quick introduction. We'll get into the conversation, and I'm also going to introduce Michelle Chen, even though she's being held hostage by a train situation. She should be with us closer to 2. So Bryce Covert, on the right, is an independent journalist writing about the economy. She's a contributing op-ed writer to the New York Times and a contributing writer at The Nation, where I had the pleasure of editing her economics column for a little while. Her writing also has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Daily News, New York Magazine, The New Republic, Slate, and others, and she won a 2016 Exceptional Merit in Media Award from the National Women's Political Caucus. She's appeared on ABC, CBS, MSNBC, NPR, and other outlets that need good economic sense. John Washington, here to my immediate right, writes about immigration and border politics, as well as criminal justice and literature. He's also a translator, having translated most recently A History of Violence by Oscar Martinez, which I would really encourage anyone to check out. Both translated works by Oscar Martinez are incredible, incredible migration journalism. And the forthcoming Blood Barrios by Alberto Arce, which won a PEN Translates Award. He's also writing a book to be published by Verso Books in 2019 on the failures and subversions of U.S. asylum law. I'll also introduce Michelle Chen, who will be here shortly. She is a contributing writer for The Nation. She's also a contributing editor at Dissent magazine and a contributing writer at In These Times. You may also know her as the co-host of Dissent's Belabored podcast, a podcast on labor with Sarah Jaffe, which is fantastic. If you haven't heard it, I would encourage you to check it out. She also studies history at CUNY Graduate Center. And without further ado, I will get us started. All of the journalists participating in this conversation today report on and understand and analyze the unlikely coalitions and tactics that workers create in the face of 21st century globalization and the rise of non-traditional and contingent work arrangements. The work of these writers in particular, I think, is very sensitive to how those labor experiences are shaped by gender, immigration status, race, and how the solutions to the oppression of workers in the 21st century will also draw on those identities and create new sorts of coalitions. So I want to start with a really broad question to sort of introduce everybody to the work of the people up here, and just begin by exploring how new types of work arrangements and new types of border policies as well have affected the work that you do, what you're covering, and the types of arrangements that you're seeing. And from there, we'll go and talk about some more specific questions and bring these sorts of work together. Bring this work together. So I wanted to start with Bryce, and go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay if I leave this where it is? So thank you for the introduction, and thank you guys so much for being here. I know that this conversation has focused a lot at this conference about immigration and borders and literal movements of people, and to some extent that does impact the work that I do. I try to focus on some of the most precarious workers, the ones who are struggling the hardest at the bottom of the income scale, who have the fewest rights, and that tends to be immigrants and people of color who are most impacted by all of these things, often sort of at the center of the Venn diagram of the things that I write about. But I've also started, my beat is economics, and I've been thinking a lot about also the borders that are more metaphorical between workers and Americans generally, thinking about whether and how people are transcending class differences, workplaces, traditional boundaries about who is and isn't unionized and who does and doesn't strike or protest or push back. I think right now it's actually a really exciting time to be thinking about those kinds of movements and the work being done there. I'm sure everybody was following, for example, the teachers' strikes that just sprung up pretty much spontaneously around the country. And I think those are really exciting, both because they're happening in a lot of states where teachers don't have the legal right to strike, so they're having to think of new tactics. And also the teachers are very much thinking outside the box. I was in Oklahoma for their strike, and everyone was really clear the teachers weren't there just for their own raises and benefits, which obviously was important to them, but they were there for school funding generally, and then even broader for just state funding for all agencies, all public sector workers who have been hit by austerity, particularly in these states that have drastically cut taxes and therefore funding for so long. So sort of that cross-coalition movement building has been really interesting. And I've been seeing it also in low-wage workforces. The Fight for 15, which if you're not familiar, started with the first ever fast food strike in New York City in 2012, has become an incredibly huge and powerful movement. They've staged a series of bigger and bigger strikes in an industry that has not been unionized, has not seen strikes. And they've also branched out, so now it includes child care providers, home health aides, adjunct professors, airport employees. So they're trying to build a coalition of precarious workers, non-unionized workers, to fight for pay for everybody. And their kinds of successes also are sort of outside the traditional boundaries. They're not necessarily, although sometimes getting a raise at their own workplaces, we've seen like a little bit of movement, you know, McDonald's raised its wages sort of. But I think more interestingly, they've won successes in legislation. So they're winning higher wages for themselves, but also for anyone who lives in the state that passes a $15 minimum wage. And they've also pushed the Democratic Party such now that the party's own platform is a $15 minimum wage, which is maybe doesn't sound so crazy now because they put that number on the map, but is pretty crazy from where I sit, knowing what Democrats were comfortable getting on board with just a couple of years ago. So I think there's a lot of really interesting organizing that's going on, trying to push past the different things that divide us and the different boundaries legally that are placed around the kinds of activities we're supposed to be doing and not supposed to be doing, and kind of branching all of that out.
Great.
Yeah, sure. Howdy. So, can y'all hear me here? This work? All right. You know, I'm trying to think about like how to frame talking a little bit about the work I'm doing right now. And you know, this morning in the paper, there was another bit about like maybe Paul Ryan is putting like documented people back into the fold, potentially a protection. And I think it's interesting, like that has been for like sort of most of the entire political spectrum, that's been like safe ground. And what isn't really safe political ground, especially for people further on the right, is talking about, you know, asylum seekers. Often, like they're being increasingly disparaged right now, and also then, like even within that portion of people, there's this dichotomy of understanding who are legitimate asylum seekers, who have valid claims, who are supposedly gaming the system, and are just economic migrants. And so right now I'm working and thinking a lot about asylum, and I think that it's really important to understand that that's a really dangerous false dichotomy, that it's really hard to disabuse the two, an economic migrant and a legitimate asylum seeker. And like going back into the history, which I'm kind of just soaking in as much as I can right now, it's really interesting to see how over the years there's been various times of sort of a dilation of the understanding of the definition of asylum and then a contraction of the definition of asylum. So I'm going to give a little bit of a brief overview right now and then jump into a story that I think will better illustrate what I'm talking about. So for a really long time, you know, for millennia, there have been various cultural and religious practices and traditions of giving asylum, providing refuge, sanctuary in churches, the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne. Like there's all of these examples you can find, which are really interesting to dig up. But the first time you see any sort of international agreements between differing states was not until the League of Nations first offered refugee status and issued Nansen passports in the 1920s. And the first people that they did it for were Russians fleeing mostly conscription to the White Army. But there was a couple other situations there too, and Armenians fleeing the Armenian genocide in Turkey. That was the very first time there was an international agreement. But it was solely isolated for those two groups of people. And then in the 30s, you saw more and more talks, and there's a number of different international conferences. And by 1951, we're probably all familiar with the Refugee Convention, in which, you know, we sort of go back to that. It's like, oh, that's like the pinnacle of humanitarianism. But if you read it, it actually only applies to people inside of Europe that faced persecution or were endangered before 1950. So it's only about the war itself. Anyone who had been uprooted or rendered stateless after that, they couldn't apply, and they didn't fall under that umbrella. So then there was like a number of iterations after that, and the time limit got taken away, and then it finally, by 1967, it was internationalized, it was globalized. So anybody, not just people in Europe, after the Holocaust, could apply for asylum or refugee status. Also interestingly, is that though the U.S. was integral in writing those original definitions, we didn't sign on until 1980. So we waited almost 30 years to actually sign that treaty. And the point here is that there's constantly changing attitude and changing understanding of what asylum is. So the actual definition goes something like someone who is in danger or faces future persecution, fears future persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, which sounds sort of maybe wonderfully capacious and like, oh, we can include everyone in there. But as I said, there's a very big difference between the application of asylum law and the definition of it. And it's been largely politically and ideologically motivated since the beginning. If the U.S. integral in writing those early definitions, we're only provided really asylum to people fleeing the communist bloc. It's sort of like a leakage of both legitimacy and sort of manpower, something like that. I think the starkest illustration of the political intentions behind how asylum law was applied was in the Cuban versus the Haitian refugees. So largely Cubans were provided some form of protection because of political motivations in regards to U.S. relations with Cuba, and Haitians were pretty much summarily rejected. They were caught by Coast Guard ships, and for the first time anyone was detained in Guantanamo Bay, it was Haitians before they were deported back to Haiti. So just like looking at those, you see that there's a clear political, ideological background to our understanding of refugee or asylum. And this is all to say, it's constantly malleable. And I think what I kind of want to do, and I think we all need to do, is lay a bit of the groundwork for making this argument that economic refugees are a legitimate thing, and we need to protect people. Can I go into an example, or do we want to switch again, or we go? Okay. So there's a number of different ways that both labor relations and just economic status play into the idea of asylum. One is that they're often an impediment to getting asylum, to even making the claim for asylum. Then while you're actually involved in the claim process, they remain an impediment. And then there's also ramifications, both in terms of personal finance, in a community structure, and in sort of the labor structuring of different communities. So jump into some concrete things here. So there's a woman, Carmen, who I'm going to kind of burn through her story, which is a long one, but I'll just kind of hit some of the highlights here. So she is from Honduras, and in 2011, her husband, this is a couple years after the coup d'etat, her husband, not able to find work, they had just had a child, decided to migrate to the United States to send back money. So he came to the U.S., he made it over the first time, he started working construction, sending money back, and Carmen is sort of like the family figurehead, she's like a really strong, savvy woman, and he was trying to get her money so she could start a restaurant, which she did. It did really well. I haven't ever tried her cooking, but I've heard a lot about it, and she specializes in rotisserie chicken. It sounds delicious. And so she started this restaurant as a 2-floor restaurant, and things were going pretty well, but part of the daily life there is that you have to pay la renta. It's extortion fees to the gangs. So she was paying about $100 a month to the gang. She was able to still keep afloat and maintain, her family. She was getting still some help from the U.S., from her husband. But then her cousin, who was facing similar extortion issues, but a little bit less, got into a bit of a scuffle and was murdered and killed. About a year later, or a couple years later, her brother-in-law, almost the same thing. He was trying to meet demands of paying la renta. He couldn't quite do it. He was shot multiple times. Carmen, at this point, had been running this successful business, had a truck and a couple employees. So her family called her, our son's just been shot. You need to come and help. So she sped over to the scene of the attacks, and he ended up dying. But she was there. She was a sort of a material witness, and he'd spoken with the guy before he left. So she became a target. Received multiple death threats by telephone. She had her business shot up. Her home was broken into. Her home was shot up. And the last straw for her was when they threatened to kill her 5-year-old son. I'm out of here. So she went to a friend's house for a little bit, tried to work up some money, and make it to the U.S. And now here's where I'm really going to speed through, and this is where the economic and like legitimate or traditional asylum claims sort of do a lot of interweaving. So to make it to the U.S., here's where the impediment happens, is that the coyote, who her ferried her husband originally, charged her $7,000, which is a pretty standard fee. It changes location to location, coyote to coyote, but that's pretty normal. To pay for that, she gave him her truck, and then she paid about $3,000 on top of that. And he gave her 2 tries. So if you didn't make it the first time, she would get to try again for free or for already included fees, and then if not, he would give her back some of the money. She made it to Mexico. She got caught by Mexican authorities, spent a couple weeks in a hellhole in a Mexican detention center, similar to the hellholes in U.S. detention centers. Then she got deported back to Honduras. The next day she went, tried again, got caught again, got returned, said, all right, you know what, this isn't going to work. She got her car back, but left with the $3,000. I'm going to go with a different coyote, $6,500 this time. One more try, she gets caught again in Mexico, returned. 4th try, she makes it. Harrowing journey, lots to talk about there, but don't have time for it. She makes it, she crosses the Rio Grande, she sees a Border Patrol agent, an act legal in all national, international, under all national, international laws, asks for asylum. They put her in a family detention center in Artesia, Mexico, after spending 3 days in one of the hieleras, the freezing cold short-term custody detention centers. And there, she got really lucky. She got a $4,000 bond. Those bonds right now have been increasing for years. They've gone up to over $20,000 for a bond. She'd already at this point paid like $9,000. She had to scrape together $4,000 more. Her husband got 2, and her sister back in Honduras got another 2. She got out on bond, slapped an ankle bracelet on her, and now we moved in with her husband in New Orleans. Took her over a year to get a work visa, and the attorney fees, knowing that the chances of getting asylum without an attorney are not quite nil, but not very high, the attorney charged her $9,500. So after a year of working her case, she realized that it wasn't going anywhere. She had yet to receive her work permit. She contacted a pro bono legal firm in New York through a friend of a friend, and they're like, this guy's a crook. He's not doing anything. He hasn't made any movement on your case. So she had been paying in installments. She had dropped already about $3,500, and she switched to this low bono / pro bono legal firm. So she had dropped at this point about $15,000, and she had yet to actually see a judge and make her asylum claim. She has since gotten a work permit. She has since been denied her asylum claim, and she's appealing. So she also had a lot of luck. She had a pretty good starting place. She had some money. She had a family member who was working and was earning money in the U.S., and she only had a $4,000 bond. That bond could have been $20,000 more than that. We see those sometimes. And there's other cases that I've not dealt with directly where people, to get to that bond fee or to pay attorney fees, have to sell their land, sell their family land, sell their house, or we're seeing this increasingly, debt migration, where one family member tries to come to the United States to help someone out, and then they can't make it, and they need to send another family member. And she also was lucky the fact that she could pay up front. A lot of people can't, and they use what are termed usureros, like basically loan sharks, that when you're put in detention, you can't pay your interest or pay any of the money back. You start accruing interest, and it can be, it can double the amount that you originally pay. And there's been a number of situations where we've seen interest rates just skyrocket. So those are all the impediments. I'll stop because I'm talking for a while, but there's also the ramifications. And I just kind of start to mention those right there, but how that breaks up those traditional work structures, who's working, how they're working, and where they're working, all get affected by this. I'll shut up for a second.
No, I think one of the interesting sort of connections, maybe I should use this. One of the sort of interesting connections that I want to draw, this idea of legitimate claims, who has a legitimate claim to resources and who has a legitimate claim to aid or to higher wages, for that matter, government resources. I want to sort of throw it back to something Bryce has written about a lot, which are the teacher strikes. And I mean, you can take this wherever you want, obviously, but what, 8 years ago now was the first Chicago teachers strike. And at the time, it was a pretty shocking strike. And it was unique in that moment. And they were up against not just Rahm Emanuel and the powers that be, but the idea that in a way they were also doing something wrong by striking, that they were like deserting the kids, that they should care about their jobs, that they should care about the children, and that also getting involved in all these different components of what the education system should look like, not just their own wages, was some sort of breach, that this was not appropriate in some way. And I think things have come a long way between 8 years ago and the teacher strikes we're seeing now. And I'm curious if you could speak to sort of when you've talked with teachers, what they're telling you, what people's senses of what's a legitimate thing to fight over, and how that may be changing, especially with just like these layers of increased budget cuts.
Yeah. It's a really good point because I remember covering the teacher strike in Chicago. Is it really 8 years ago? And it was not seen as a sympathetic strike. It was really divisive, even among, I think, maybe particularly among Democrats or like left-leaning people, the progressive movement. I mean, part of it, I guess, is that they were up against Rahm Emanuel, who is sort of a perfect stand-in for that schism anyway. He was part of Obama's administration. He's also extremely neoliberal, perhaps is maybe even like a kind way to put it. I think some of what's happened is that attitudes have changed. I mean, you can just see in polling that attitudes towards unions have really changed, and I think a lot of that is probably born out of economic frustration and a lot more workers feeling disempowered in their workplace and starting to figure out, oh, yeah, maybe if we could band together, we'd have more power against our boss who's like really tyrannical and just sets our schedules without our say and never gives us raises when we ask for them. I think another thing you have to look at with the teachers' strikes is race. There were a lot of black teachers involved in the Chicago strike. They were led by Karen Weaver, who's a black woman. I will say, I mean, I was only in Oklahoma, but from the pictures I saw in other places, I think this was true, that the teachers there are overwhelmingly white. So I think there may be something going on there in terms of the public support they got. But also, teachers were very, very careful when I talked to them in Oklahoma about being clear that they weren't just fighting for themselves, which I think is smart and interesting and potentially very powerful, that they were fighting for support staff, buses and janitors and things like that, as well as, like I said, like other state agencies. They were offered a raise just for teachers, and they said no. They still walked out and said, we need funding, we need to fix our budget, which I think helped really garner public support. But then it also sort of begs the question of, can teachers not just ask for a raise for themselves and have that be enough? Do you have to be fighting for someone other than yourself for the public to stand behind you? And I don't think we know really the answer to that yet. The fight for 15 also happened in that intervening time. Probably, they are union-backed. They are not part of a union, so they're this funny sort of hybrid. They are part of the traditional labor movement, but they aren't necessarily seen as union workers. But I think they may have also not only gotten Americans more comfortable with unions, but also the idea of striking. That being something that we can do, and maybe we should from time to time. And they are fighting for themselves to a large extent, but like I said, the victories have been widely shared. So there may be not, and this is not to say that Chicago teachers were just out for themselves. Like you said, like they were out there fighting for their kids. They were out there fighting against educational reforms that they felt were weakening public schools. But I think the narrative that built around them for some reason, somewhat unfairly, was that they were just out there trying to get more money. And so there may be a need to if you want to be seen as deserving, be asking for someone beyond yourself, which is also very gendered. I mean, these teacher workforces and also low-wage service workers are all majority female, which I also think plays into whether we see them as deserving, and give them support when they ask for money or go on strikes. I am not a labor organizer, so I don't feel like I can really give the answers to all of these questions, but I think there is this open question of, in our day and age, can you just go out and say, pay us more and get the public to rally behind you? Or do you need to be fighting for something larger and bigger than yourself? Michelle's here now.
Yeah, welcome to Michelle, who was thwarted by evil trains.
And had to sadly resort to cabbing it over, but I managed to make it in time rather than brave the LIRR, which I have not done in many years, so I wasn't going to trust myself with that. But yes, but nonetheless, solidarity with public transit. I swear.
We'll just blame this on Cuomo. Is that fine?
Yeah. I'm good.
I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, it all comes back to just blaming it all on Cuomo. But speaking of which, I just wanted to add a bit about the...
Go right ahead.
One of the interesting things about, maybe one of the interesting contrasts, which is not necessarily positive or negative, is that the Chicago Teachers Union was actually extremely unified in its militancy when the strike happened. So the CTU had a very much like sort of, it was the rank and file engaged with the union leadership across the city. So in addition to all these other climactic factors like, Chicago being a different city, Oklahoma and all these other places being more of a statewide thing, I think they were, the teachers were able to galvanize in these other places outside of their union and sometimes in defiance of the union leadership. So they were, in that sense, wildcat strikes, as you noted in your reporting. So what does that mean when you have workers organizing outside of the structure of the union versus within it? What does it mean when there's actually conflict between perhaps the union, the top union officials, and the teachers in the rank and file? And so that tension is something that can be very fruitful and can yield a lot of political energy on the ground, but it also requires some structure outside of the union apparatus itself. So that might be something to keep in mind for future organizing.
And I just would want to quickly add, I feel like we can't talk about unionizing without talking about the Janus decision that's going to come down from the Supreme Court, which just briefly, everyone's expecting the court to rule that if if you're a public employee and you don't want to pay union dues to a union that's representing all employees and bargaining to get better wages and benefits for everyone, you don't have to, which is probably going to deal a pretty big financial blow to the entire union movement. And so I think there's a question now of, so what do we do if unions are weakened even further? And I find some hope in the teachers' movements because they were not led by the unions at all. The unions were led by workers and had to scramble to catch up. I think it's really interesting. I think it speaks to an appetite for change. I think it speaks to an appetite for militancy and action. And I wonder if in the wake of Janus, that will only increase. Everybody's saying that when unions don't have sort of the fees that keep them financially healthy and the legal means to peaceful union elections and contract negotiations, everybody gets more militant. I think we're about to see that put to the test.
I mean, those teachers in many cases were living already in the post-Janus world, long before the Janus decision, the pending Janus decision, so we can learn from their example and just in terms of how they worked. Many of them did not even, first of all, striking is illegal, right? And second of all, I mean, there were already right to work states already, and so there was already this mass erosion. So,
and this is maybe something we could address directly. And okay, I'm making a rule that we have to take the mics out and pass them because I think otherwise the live stream will not work.
So, bar mitzvah style.
Exactly. One of the things that crops up, I think, in all of your work is we are both in an era where labor has been pushed pretty far back, and pending Supreme Court decisions threaten that further. We're also in an era of here and there a real rise in militancy. And it's an interesting contrast because the most precarious workers are not necessarily going to be the most militant. It's very hard to be militant when you're extremely precarious. On the other hand, it's an incentive. And so in the teachers' strikes, we've seen these as rank and file strikes. And so I'm interested in the work that you all are doing. We've seen this absolutely in the immigration rights movement, where people are very, very vulnerable, especially if they're undocumented. There have still been extremely brave demonstrations and strikes where people took real risks to put themselves out there visibly, especially as undocumented people. And I'm interested for each of you in the work that you're doing right now, how you're seeing this relationship between increased precarity and increased militancy, and where that is most powerful, and maybe also, where precarity is actually sort of preventing or heading off more militancy among workers and among immigrants.
I don't cover labor that closely, like in my actual work, but one of the things I think where we see this interesting overlap of precarity and then militancy is in the refugee caravan that has just been making the news. So that caravan was really led by a bunch of trans migrants. And they had been doing this for a number of different years, and I haven't covered it, but I've just been following it pretty closely. They've been doing it for a number of different years, and that was one of the threads that really didn't get picked up in any of the media, despite the tweeting, the president's tweets about it, and like the hysteria that got drummed up. But the majority of the people who were actually leading that were trans, and we saw with the one death in the Cibola detention center recently, it has like really serious repercussions, and they're incredibly vulnerable passing through Mexico, and then of course also in detention. So that's one sort of example, and then I guess where I see the opposite of that a little bit is where people who are vulnerabilized or whatever, made vulnerable, I don't know if that's a word, but then also like aren't able to organize very well, and you see that it is effective. And I saw this before I moved into New York. I was in Arizona for a while, and I did some reporting out in the lettuce fields in southwestern Arizona. And there, these are the same fields that like Chavez was organizing in a while ago, and right now they are largely, at least what I've seen, they're largely unorganized. They still use a lot of the guest worker programs, but the people who actually work there, I was sort of shocked to really sink into this, is that they are like no longer sort of exploited because of their immigration status. They have status. Most of them are either legal permanent residents or actually citizens, but they're paid such low wages, and they have only availability to work for the growing season, that the majority of them now are actually living across the border in Mexico, and they make the trek daily, which costs anywhere from an extra couple hours to sometimes even more than that. They cross over between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning to get out in the fields by 4:30 to start harvesting lettuce. And if anyone here has eaten a Caesar salad in the last 6 months, I can guarantee you, or at least with 90% certainty, that they came from those fields. And they have no time or energy to do anything else but what they're doing. And then when they are not seasonally employed, they either following the harvest or following a different harvest to Salinas Valley or different parts of California, or they're unemployed and they collect unemployment, but they have to cross over the border to do that and to access any of the services. So there's like, a lot of people have talked about the Border Patrol being like the most effective strike breakers, or like the people who can like stop organizing from happening. Right now, like the Border Patrol at least CBP is giving a pass to them because they have documents, and the people who are most effectively prohibiting organizing is just the corporate structure, which doesn't pay enough, and then is able to finagle the work hours such that there's just no time left over.
2 points about the intersection between migration and precarity and how that affects labor. I think when reporting on labor organizing, it's hard to think of a story that doesn't intersect with the immigration system in some way, because so much of the working class today, frankly, is like implicated in, if they are not migrants themselves, then they are working alongside them, and their work lives are very much implicated in how migration policy works, even though it may not seem that way on the surface. So I think thinking structurally about how precarity and globalization intersect and how that affects our border policy. For instance, a lot of the influx of migrants across the U.S.-Mexico border is a direct result of NAFTA, right, which is also known for disrupting many industries in the U.S. at the same time. At the same time that it was rupturing manufacturing sectors in the U.S. and the heartland and the Rust Belt, it was also leading to mass displacement of Mexican farmers, right, and they're moving up north to find work. Right? And what happens when they stay, or what happens when the border tightens? Well, they're compelled to stay in the United States so they can stay with their families. What happens when their kids grow up? What happens when they try to seek higher income? Then they move into other industries, right? They become part of the social fabric. And if we don't find a way to find more in common with those workers that are coming in than we do to, stand apart from them, then the labor movement is going to keep on going down this increasing spiral of disunity, right? Which is, of course, also part of what precarity does, right? It disunifies the workforce. It atomizes workers from each other. Something closer to home and closer to my journey here, in fact, is what's happened to the taxi cab industry here in New York City, right? There's this eternal battle going on right now with Uber. I think all three, or at least most of the recent suicides in the cab industry have been of people who were not born in this country, right? Many of them worked hard, tried to, perhaps sink their life savings into that one cab medallion, thinking that it was going to be their sort of bread and butter on their path to the American dream, right? So they came here with that narrative in mind, and for a while, this industry was able to offer that to many migrants. But when Uber came around and was sort of the new kid on the block, and they did this in part by hiring many new immigrant drivers, right? So it's sort of like these nonstop flows of migration are creating new influxes of precarious labor, increasingly desperate, low-wage workers willing to work for less, right? And so everyone is making a rational choice in this. When those cab drivers didn't have a traditional union, right? There's the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, which is wonderful work organizing the cab drivers, but it's still outside of a formal union. They do not have formal collective bargaining rights. So in the absence of that, they resorted to a licensing scheme that promised them some form of sort of entrepreneurship asset building in the form of investing in a medallion, right? But that imploded because the market imploded. And now we're stuck with an ever-growing pool of Uber drivers competing against traditional cabbies. All of them are immigrants, right? And we have the city at war, or the taxi commission and individual cab and limousine services, incumbents in the industry, rivaling disruptive Silicon Valley investors, right? None of the people who win from this, whether it's the traditional industries or the disruptors, right? None of them are workers, right? The workers lose at both ends. So that's a foundation to build on. That's a common experience that both globalization and precarity hath wrought, right? But it takes a lot to understand, to come to a consciousness about how that all fits together. Because what the precarious economy does is that it gives us tunnel vision, right? So that we only see our own individual plights and we don't see them meshing together as a collective whole. So sometimes unions are at the front end of that, galvanizing people, and sometimes unions have to follow and workers come to consciousness by themselves. And so either way, I mean, that's the direction that labor has to go.
Just to leap off of that too, so to talk about the places where I don't see militancy coming or happening right now is, I think, the gig economy, Uber workers, people who are picking up jobs through apps. I don't want to overstate how big a piece of the economy that is. There was actually numbers that were released yesterday that show that it's actually probably not as huge and growing as we think it is because we all use these apps. But it is a share of the workforce that is independent contractors, Uber drivers, and I have not seen a whole lot of organizing among those workers yet, and I think it's because they are very isolated from each other. They are very precarious. And I also think the gig economy, I think part of why it maybe makes more headlines than perhaps its share of the economy would warrant is because it's this answer to the problem that is very capitalistic and American, which is that, oh, you don't make enough money? Go pick up extra work on Uber. Go get a handy whatever. So I think the way that people are being pushed towards these jobs in the first place is that it's this personal solution to a personal problem rather than let's come up with a way to make sure that your actual job pays you well so you don't have to go work for Uber. That's not to say that I don't think there couldn't be organizing there, but I haven't seen it happening yet. And then sort of similarly, but on the opposite end of the income scale, is to check the tech sector in general is very resistant to unionizing. I think a lot of that is prestige, pay. Certainly a lot of these people are paid well, but not everyone. A lot of people who work inside Google's headquarters are contractors, but there's still a cachet to working there. They treat you like you're in some sort of dormitory/playground where there's ping pong and stuff. And so I think I would love to see, I guess is what I'm saying, some hints of unionization among tech workers to both the contractors and the staff, people who are probably making a lot of money. Where I do see exciting things happen is some outsourced work for tech companies. We've seen some interesting pushback. The janitors who clean Google and Facebook have been working together to push them for better pay and conditions and winning. They got benefits, they got better pay, I think mostly through public shaming, which is awesome and was really effective. I've seen some of that happening in contracted workers who are, in Amazon warehouses. Just this week, there was a warehouse where people were complaining of fainting because there was no AC, and it was during Ramadan, so people were fasting, and they banded together and they got AC, which sounds like a small victory, but is really, they all felt like it was a huge win because they stood up to Amazon and they won. So I think there's some of that going on. And there is, I think, a lot of militancy and organizing happening among precarious workers in other places. I've mentioned the Fight for 15, which I just think cannot be overstated how important and exciting that is, and it continues. It's got full momentum still. I don't think it's petered out at all. Teachers, obviously. Retail is getting more and more organized. There's actually a growing movement that's calling itself Rise Up Retail. It's kind of an outgrowth of the organizing that was in Walmart. But expanding now to other retailers and also taking on the fact that private equity firms came in and bought up a bunch of retailers and now they're all going bankrupt, which means that everybody's losing their jobs and not getting severance. And so they're taking on not just pay and working conditions while you have a job, but these Wall Street people coming in and screwing with your job and then taking it away in the end. And I also would want to mention further up the income scale, possibly, but just as precarious often, is journalists. There's been a wave of organizing among online journalists. I helped organize.
Here, give me that one.
Maybe you can. Is this? Okay. Sorry. I got too worked up. I helped organize my workplace when I was on staff at Think Progress, and there's been, I'm not even going to be able to remember all of them because there's been just this wave of unionization, and I think what's exciting to me about that is it's, I think, mostly driven by younger people, people who have perhaps more privilege and resources in this economy yet still feel precarious and are able to recognize their status as workers and come together and say we are better off together unionized than we are as like a family with a boss who has an open door. So I think again, it's not like a huge portion of the economy. Journalists we're a small number, even though we like to think that we rule everything. But I think the signs of what that means for our generation and people of more means is really exciting too.
So I want there to be plenty of time for questions and comments, given that everyone here is kind of an expert on the same terrain. We're going to go till 3:15 actually, so that there's a little time afterwards for people to mingle and talk further if they like. I don't know what the best logistical way is there a mic we can pass, or is it best if people just put a hand up, or? Okay, sure. If you can make this one work, then it's yours. And yeah, in the meantime, I'm going to pass this to Michelle, and then we'll.
Just an addendum on the Silicon Valley thing. I just wanted to point to two things. I mean, and it's sort of linked to the contingent worker survey. The contingent worker survey that came out yesterday, that's new data from the Census Bureau about which workers are, either contingent, like sort of on a more casual basis, maybe they're independent contractors, informal sector workers, people who don't have a standard employment relationship. So that count actually went down a little bit as an overall portion of the labor force. That being said, in absolute numbers, it increased by several tens of thousands. So just in order to keep statistics in mind, we need to also recognize that what constitutes a growing workforce may not be growing proportionately at the same rate as the rest of the economy, which has been expanding, frankly, since the 2007 election, and the last contingent worker survey was done in 2005. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the other thing about the data that was interesting is that if you look at who is doing these jobs, increasingly they are low wage, even more precarious circumstances, right? Less, lower sort of working conditions overall, in increasingly marginalized sectors, increasingly doing subcontractual work, and increasingly they're people of color, right? So we see a polarization in the workforce, and that may be the biggest takeaway from this new trend towards contingency, which is the sense that as the workforce casualizes, right, it also polarizes. And that has implications for the class structure, as well as the racial hierarchy, as well as the gender hierarchy, because you know that in these precarious jobs, oftentimes it is people of color, immigrants, and women who are doing the work, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind about, sort of what is trending upward versus downward among contingent workers. By that same token, we can say that the Silicon Valley workforce, whether it's the high-paid end or the low-paid end, represents just a small sector of the economy, right? But in essence, it's the largest workforce in the world because we all work for Google, right? We are all content providers. We are not compensated, right, for the service that we provide them, but we provide them with our data, our information, and our preferences, right, and sort of the insights into our deepest, darkest psyches, right, that even we are not aware of subconsciously every time we use those apps. And so one of the reasons we think, the tech workforce must be huge is because, even though it may formally employ a very small number of people, it is a ginormous part of our everyday lives, right? So that is a sign of both the fact that we are such a consumption-driven economy, but also the fact that what we think of as consumption today is also production, right? We have to think more about our lives as workers rather than as consumers. So we're not just users of apps. Uber drivers are classified as users of the Uber app, right? So what does that mean when your entire work life and your salary and your hours of work are dictated by an app that you're a mere user of? You downloaded it onto your phone just like everyone else, so they think that's their only responsibility towards you. The end service, so the tail end user agreement that you sign at the end that everyone just clicks through and says, I agree, right? Would you do that to a labor contract? I know you'd like to think that you would read through the first couple pages at least, right? Before, unlike the terms of service or whatever. So, and okay, one more thing about the tech workers. Even at the very high paid end, we just had the Tech Workers Coalition take action in a joint petition against Google to collectively put pressure on the executives to stop contracting with the Department of Defense, right? They were using AI, right, to do Pentagon-related projects related to creating robots, presumably for military purposes, right? And so enough tech workers at the top of the Google ladder, right, even though they didn't have a union, even though many of them may have been independent contractors or independent researchers that were just sort of partnering with Google, right? The people behind this petition, they organized this effort and they got enough workers on Google's staff to say no, right? And so that wasn't part of any collective bargaining agreement. It wasn't part of any formal labor contract, but they still stood up and they got the Google CEOs to cease using contracting with the Department of Defense. So, that's just an example of labor organizing outside of these so-called bread and butter workplace issues that we should all keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And on the point of all of us working for tech companies on some level, there was a sort of art project which then someone wrote an article about by the same name called Wages for Facebook, which took the wages for housework concept and applied it to Facebook as unwaged labor that we're all doing, wherein we share our feelings and they make money. So, worth checking out. That was in Dissent some time ago. I want to open it up now. We do have 2 working mics. Very exciting. Does anyone have a question or want to weigh in? I don't believe you. No. Okay, great.
Hey, thanks. So I've been asking naive questions for the last couple of days because I'm from the UK and I'm not that familiar with the US in various ways. But it was interesting to hear the discussion about migration and labour, particularly in relation to a question I've been thinking about who is the working class, right? So in the UK, there's a phrase that's increasingly got a lot of political purchase, which is white working class, which obviously has the effect of aligning the two together.
We have that here too.
Right. And so I think one of the important tactical things to stress is that migrant workers, non-white workers, are the working class as well. And I think certainly in the US, there's a sense that racial solidarity tends to trump class solidarity in most cases, right? So I was wondering where you saw the current state of play in terms of that sort of inter-working class solidarity and conflict and what the prospects are for the future there.
So, yeah, we have that too. Especially it's been really, I think, frustrating for a lot of us after Trump's election because it was all about the white working class.
White male working class.
Yes, white male working class. And I will refrain from getting into analyzing the election because I don't think that's what it was about. But there are really interesting things going on to build coalitions that are cross-racial, taking on economic issues. And one of them that we haven't mentioned but is really exciting, I think, is the Poor People's Campaign. So basically it's reviving the more or less the Rainbow Coalition that Jesse Jackson the movement he was creating, and they are taking on, as the name would suggest, the Poor People's Campaign, a lot of the issues that they're taking on are economic in nature, but it's very much cross-racial, and it's also about climate change, and it's about all these other issues, and it's, I think, in large part coming out of the Moral Mondays movement, which started in North Carolina, which also has a very, as that name would imply, sort of moral and spiritual center to them, basically about right and wrong. I think what they're doing, first of all, just having a campaign in this country called the Poor People's Campaign is very exciting. Poor and poverty as words are not ones that make it into our political conversation very often. And then also seeing who's leading it and the way they're talking about these issues, I think, is really heartening. So that's going on, and again, not to keep talking about the Fight for 15, but I think that they've done a really great job there. Most of the leadership there are people of color, is workforces that are majority people of color and women, service sector jobs mostly, who are leading the fight. And I mean, that's the face of our working class in this country. We certainly still have some, white dudes in hard hats, but that's not the majority of it. It's much more diverse in lots of different ways. So I think there is really cool movements going on there, despite the fact that like cable TV doesn't talk about it that way.
I have a follow-up question, actually. I just wonder, and I don't know the answer to any of these, but what, like, besides being like racially or gender inclusive in Fight for 15 or the Poor People's Campaign, what about how inclusive are they, or what's the relationship they have to the undocumented? And it kind of leads to another question that I've been trying to ask, and I've talked to some people, some undocumented people about, is like how rising minimum wages affect wages that undocumented people get. And I wonder if it seems like I haven't seen any studies done, but I'm just curious, like how quickly it affects it, or how it affects it at all.
So, I mean, you can probably like pick any study to reaffirm your beliefs about the impact of immigration on the labor force, right? But overall, I mean, there have been pretty reputable, solid, and replicable studies that suggest strongly that first of all, immigration is hands down an integral part of economic growth overall, right? And so in that sense, it has an aggregate positive effect on growing the labor force and raising wages overall. It does cause disruption at the lower end of the workforce. So there will likely be targeted displacement in certain industries, but interestingly, often the people who are displaced are other immigrants. So our workforce is so entrenched in the migration system overall that, I mean, you have sort of waves of immigrant workers displacing incumbent immigrant workers, right? But beyond this narrative of displacement, because I don't want to think about it as a zero-sum game, right? The reason we have displacement comes down to decisions that employers make, right? It is not the fact that there are only so many jobs and like there's like a finite number of jobs in the universe, or that they cannot afford to pay higher wages, right? It's that they set the price of labor and they set the size of their workforce, and it's not the workers who are making that decision, right? So, and as far as disruption goes, I mean, the major forces that have led to mass layoffs, I think we also have to think about the changes in industry and automation as one of the key drivers of that displacement, right? So there's a lot of focus on trade right now, as outsourcing jobs or bringing in new undocumented labor, or even bringing in some, allowing sort of legal migration to allegedly take the place of American workers because they allegedly won't work for those wages, which might be true because no one wants to work for poverty wages, frankly. So I guess like it's creating a false sense of worker choice, in the sense that people, the canard that you usually see thrown in front of you is that, well, it's the undocumented workers who are willing to work for this little pay. Americans, they're so self-satisfied that they're just not willing to work for sub-minimum wage. It's like, well, we have a minimum wage for a reason, right? So if we looked at it from the other way around and looked at it in terms of uplifting workers' conditions altogether, then we'd have, first of all, less pressure to migrate, because that would be operating on a global scale, right? It would be a virtuous circle instead of a vicious cycle. And second of all, it would create more solidarity between the workers who are fearing that they're going to lose the jobs that they've clung to for so long, or that their wages are going to go down, and the workers who are very legitimately seeking economic opportunity to get themselves out of desperate poverty, right? In neither of those situations can you blame the worker for acting rationally in their position. So these studies will show aggregate effects of, whether one industry versus another is being disrupted. But the exact wrong approach is for Donald Trump to parachute into coal country and say, we're going to nix environmental regulations so we can bring back coal. Well, the reason coal jobs went to China and other places that have these massive coal fields is because those workers are dying every day in the mines because they have no workplace safety regulations and they have no functioning unions to give them rights on the job. So, and this is also true in the UK. We have a lot of backlash. I think the narrative around Brexit has also been very similar in terms of people wanting to supposedly take back the country, right? It's often framed in these sort of coded words like, sovereignty and, like, we're going to declare our independence, right? I mean, what they're really hearkening back to is a day when, white men basically ran a lot more shit even more than they do now. So looking at this thing that we call the working class as something that is constantly changing but exists as a fact within capitalism always helps us get around this wedge of, I think, what is often termed as identity politics, right? So it's a way to divide and conquer, which is the old narrative, right? But because we've lost class consciousness, we seek collectivity in other forms. And what forms this will take is very much dependent on the future of how we see ourselves as political actors.
And I'm guessing, it sounds like also, John, your specific question, one of them was whether raises in minimum wage affect undocumented folks. And I don't know the answer to that. Is that something that's been looked at closely? Do we know?
Will go up when you have more workers in the workforce and there's just more productivity overall. But in terms of in specific jobs, you'll find wages being undercut in many cases not because undocumented workers are there, but because people who are in a position to set their wages insist on paying them less. So yes, there could be instances in specific jobs where bosses are undercutting wages, but it's not the undocumented workers who are doing it, right? They would willingly take whatever they can get, but all that they can get when they're stranded in the U.S. and looking for work and they fear daily getting arrested and deported is to work for the wage that they're being offered, right?
And just like as a simple answer to that question, and again, you can pick a study that shows that the minimum wage hurts or helps wages or hurts or helps workers, but basically the consensus of the literature is that raising the minimum wage raises wages and doesn't really hurt jobs. It has basically a zero impact on jobs, and that is going to help immigrants of all kinds, particularly undocumented ones. I mean, as you're saying, the power differential is so much greater when you're so much more vulnerable than when we raise the legal wage that you have to be paid. That can only help them. I mean, that only gives workers more power because you're raising their baseline without them having to do it. I mean, there's a question of whether employers are going to actually pay them that. And certainly, we know that in times when immigration status is threatened, people are less likely to push for those rights. We're seeing that right now with workplace raids. The outcome of workplace raids is that we're all less safe because immigrant workers, documented and undocumented, are not going to talk to regulators or call in complaints about unsafe working conditions or not being paid their wages. But in theory, they have just as many rights too, and they stand to be paid more.
Do we have any other question? I think there's someone back there.
My question comes from my own work. I'm working on how do we rethink from an ethics perspective, sort of the ethics of work in relation to reproductive justice. That's where my question is coming from. But one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, and I want to get your take on how you see sort of the role of reproduction, and I mean that in the broader sense of social reproduction as well as in the narrower senses, but we've talked about globalization and we've talked about precarity, but also the role of reproduction in its broadest sense plays into sort of the reworking of the economy. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about is, or that I've noticed is, so much of the labor militancy that y'all noted, that a number of us have noted, is coming in sectors that are part of how society reproduces, how society keeps itself alive. And one of the things I've been thinking about more is part of what we're seeing now is capitalism is having to reckon with the fact that for so long it had depended on unpaid social reproduction, and then the people that is women, who had primarily been providing that, then their families couldn't survive unless they went into the workforce too. So now the people who are supposed to be providing the unpaid social reproduction are also in the productive workforce, and that puts pressures on where we're getting society's social reproductive capacities. And is part of what I'm wondering, is part of what's driving this particular labor moment about capitalism depends on and parasitizes a certain amount of social reproduction, but if it's not possible to do that, then capitalism itself can't function, and that's part of the friction point that creates both the possibility but also the risk of being further reincorporated by capitalism. I don't know if that makes sense, but essentially is part of what we're seeing that, in a Fordist economy where you've got the productive sphere and the home sphere and it's very gender segregated, that has a certain logic to it. That kind of logic can't work anymore. And we have all these different kind of struggles around sort of reproduction. I mean, so there's a recent book you've probably seen about, how all politics became reproductive politics out of California Press. I don't know that I agree with that thesis, but I am curious about the ways in which reproductive politics in the broader sense is potentially a driving force in the politics of labor and the politics of work now.
Yeah, that is a great question and like a great rundown of the crisis of care, as some people would describe it. Yeah. I mean, a number of you have written about that.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that for a really long time, and I won't. So I'll say like two things. One is that, yes, I mean, so there's the fact that jobs that have so long been seen as women's work and therefore things that are done for either no pay or very little pay and out of the goodness of your heart have become jobs, and I think people are pushing for them to be recognized as such. So teachers are a huge example. I mean, we've had teachers forever, but they've always been underpaid, and people are supposed to be doing it for passion and care for their kids, and that's why I think they're paid so little, particularly given how much education and experience they all have. It's true of home health aides, it's true of child care workers, all these ways in which care work, I think now people are really trying to push for adequate pay. I mean, and it's crazy also that we underpay these people who are doing literally the most vital and important work in our society. But because it's seen as the women's care work that has always existed for free and for love, we just pay them nothing. I think there is a movement toward that. I mean, some of it is, like Fight for 15 or strikes or things like that where they're pushing for better pay. And I think also some of it is people are pushing for the government to actually do something about funding childcare. And those people are incorporating into that fight. That includes paying people better, treating them better, making sure that the providers aren't paid worse than zookeepers, which they are. And then the other side of that is just women as workers, like you said, having to leave the house because we need dual income to survive for the most part now, and how that's happened. And in some countries, policy has sort of followed them, and obviously in ours, it just hasn't. So again, I mean, the fight for childcare is about both of those things. It's about the providers, but it's also about women being able to be equal workers in this economy and not be on the hook for what do I do with my kid until they're school age. But it's also paid leave, paid sick days, all these sort of basic labor standards that would help everyone work better, but particularly women, because they're still the ones shouldering the second shift. They're still the default caretakers in so many families. So all of those have movements behind them right now, and I think they're exciting. I think we expected to see a lot more policy movement if Donald Trump hadn't been elected, but I still think Ivanka's going to save us all. But I do think the movement and the energy is still there, and I think it's just an issue that's waiting for the right Congress and the right president.
It's interesting that you bring up reproductive care and all of the spheres that it exists, because I think that can also be summed up in two words: domestic work. Right? Where did that come from? But we also have a growing domestic workers movement around the world, and they're not all unified by a union or anything like that. but the International Labor Organization several years ago enacted it's called a domestic workers, essentially it's modeled on the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, right? It is a code of rights and protections that all domestic workers should be entitled to globally, right? And you have many, many countries signing on to that accord. So, I mean, that's not to say that they'll magically get these rights tomorrow, but, you know, as more countries ratify that, then the more there's a building social consensus around the fact that these people are A, part of our workforce, and B, a valuable part of the economy as well as our community lives, right? And I think this division that used to exist very clearly between the productive sphere and the domestic sphere, the fact that that's been disrupted does not mean that they're meshed in a healthy way today, right? We see the lines being drawn in terms of the material conditions that these people are being subjected to, in terms of the gender hierarchies in the workforce, right? So there still is that division, right? It's just moved into the workplace, or rather the workplace has moved into the home, quite literally, right? So yeah, teaching is an act of reproduction, but also like we should recognize that the movements of today, whether it's militant teachers strikes or domestic workers movements, those are building on earlier movements that occurred during the civil rights movement. We had black women mobilizing as domestic workers. They were called household workers. There's a big Household Workers Unite movement. Pramila and Addison was doing a lot of great work on that, and sort of uncovering these earlier antecedents of the domestic workers movement. And the interesting thing about that is when those black workers either left the workforce or they found that it was no longer sustainable for them, who filled their place as domestic workers? Immigrants, right? So we see this sort of musical chairs operating within the working class, whereas different configurations of brown and black faces, but one through line is that they're almost always women, right? They're always poor, right? And they always are not thought of as real workers, right? And so if we use that as a unifying force rather than who we belong to, then we start to conceive of our communities in a larger way, right? Those household workers, the domestic workers, I mean, where this is sort of operating on sort of an exponential degree is Filipino home care workers, right? They've left their home countries and gone halfway around the world to perform domestic work. So there's a lot of dialogue around their conditions here, but there's much less dialogue around what's happening in their households back in the Philippines. There are kids growing up there who themselves need care, right? So even in the sense that, say we have women farm workers in the US, right? They're not engaged in an active, say, domestic work per se, but their unmet needs are feeding this economy that profits off of the degradation of maternal care, right? Off of parental care, I should say, and off of reproductive care, right? And turns and monetizes that, right? And meanwhile, they can't put food on their own tables, right? Same with, and so whether that person is providing work in the home as an immigrant domestic worker or child care worker, and then still being forced to essentially neglect their kids at home, right? Or they're out in the fields, right? There's a political economy around the absence in the home and what then fills that space, right? If you only have enough hours in the day to fill that space with the wages that you need to sustain your family, like on a physical material basis, then what else is lost in that equation, right? How far does that depart from our ideal of what raising a child should be, right? And all of that, what's lost for that working class family is being redistributed upward to an upper middle class family somewhere, right? So if we think about the totality of how this workforce operates, and we see who profits and who loses, but we also see that we ourselves as consumers are implicated in that, right? And so with domestic work, the example is particularly acute because there, very literally, you have the householder as the employer as well. But it operates on many different levels in the economy.
Maybe I'll just throw in really quick that if we look at, like, again, what I already mentioned and what's big in the news in terms of migration right now is the family separation issue. And there's a number of things, maybe just to kind of throw out there a couple ideas is, one is in Dilley, the South Texas residential detention center, tried a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, to license itself as a child care facility. And if I remember correctly, they actually gained that license, and then it was denied. So right now it's not. But, also, like, family separation is, huge in the news right now. It has been going on for a really long time. And, there's right now currently 4 so-called family detention centers, but they're not family detention centers. They've been separating the fathers always from the children. So only mothers and children are allowed to stay together, and the fathers are always separated. And then one other thing to kind of bring in to tie back to some, just like historically, just remembering is the law that is being used right now, the zero tolerance law that Jeff Sessions is trying to enforce in order to separate the families as a means of deterrence and punishment, goes back. It's called Blease's law. It's the first time that that unlawful entry was actually prosecuted at all, and it was in the 1930s. A senator from, I think, South Carolina wrote the law, and they passed it. And he was a self-affirmed white supremacist and pro-lyncher. And so that's the law that we're using right now to separate families, separate children from their mothers.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. Yes, great.
Hi. I just wanted to sort of invert. Does my voice sound really weird in there? Is it? I just wanted to sort of invert the debate a little bit, because I've been listening to, especially the debate around women's work and unpaid labour. And I was thinking, do you think that the economic model is absolutely the worst model to sort of defend workers' rights by in any way? So, earlier you were saying migrant labour, it improves productivity. I think that argument is actually the worst argument that you can make, is to sort of start to value people, because if we're doing it, people in this room start to valuing people only on what they're valued to the market, then we failed. So, I would like to hear more really debates around human value, human rights, much less about economic value and the economic value that migrants or women could bring. And then the second point of inversion, I suppose, is the inversion that, again, we're talking and focusing constantly on the victims of capitalism. But again, we're not thinking about the people that benefit out of that. And the women who come from the Philippines and leave their children, whose houses are they going to work in? Whose families are benefiting from this, and, which structure is benefiting from this. And it's not the white working class. So, again, I think rather than focus on the victims of capitalism, I think we need to switch it and look at those that are actually benefiting out of that system.
Great, so there are 2 parts to that. It looks like, Michelle, you want to start? Yeah, I thought you might. Yeah.
I did bring that up, and I was trying to reiterate what studies have said. Like, these are econometric studies that are put out by economists, right? So they're going to be thinking about aggregate growth. But yes, I agree that we should not be saying that economic growth is a universal good, and therefore anything that's good to grow the economy is therefore good for workers, right? So aggregate wages going up doesn't mean anything to the worker who just lost their job, right? Similar with trade, right? I mean, we see arguments for so-called free trade, which isn't actually free trade, but the arguments for free trade agreement is, well, the economy as a whole will benefit from this because businesses will thrive and people will be able to get cheaper goods at Walmart and everything will be great. But just because we're growing as a consumption force right, doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to translate into workers' pockets. And the growing disconnect between what that does to workers versus what that does for the consumer economy is exactly where capitalism leverages its power, right? Because by getting us to think about the benefits of consumption, right, it implicates us all as beneficiaries, going back to your beneficiaries question, of this system, right? So we can't even think about ourselves outside of, a world where we're constantly on our phones. Soon it will be like we're constantly on our, implanted microchips or whatever. But we're all sort of implicated in this mesh of the digital economy, whether we want to or not. So the idea, remember a few months ago, everyone was like, boycott Facebook, and that was like a hashtag for like half an hour on Twitter, and then everyone just went back to Facebook. Right, so we have trouble resting ourselves from the system. Not that we should blame ourselves for that, but we should at least be cognizant of that when we're thinking about things like labor. And one of the most exploitative tactics, right, that capital has used throughout the ages, it's not just a digital economy thing, is to think about ourselves as, think about economic growth as a matter of individual choice and individual decision making, right? And so this focus, this very American focus, I should say, on individualism, right, which finds its way into all sorts of neoliberal thinking, right, is exactly what is anti-class consciousness. Rather than thinking about ourselves as members of a class, right, we think about ourselves as individual strivers. And that leads to this zero-sum mentality, where we think, oh, well, as long as I get mine, right, I'm benefiting from the system, which may be true in a very short and narrow sense, but as we're seeing right now, as growing members of the former middle class are finding themselves in the doldrums and finding themselves without jobs, that's having very destructive effects, and it can either manifest itself in maybe more people deciding to vote for the reality TV star they see on TV because he seems like a guy I could have a beer with, and I don't know what he's about, but he's about sticking it to the establishments. This is my middle finger to whoever fucked me over and took away my job, right? So that might be the calculation that some people resort to. The other calculation might be, well, this is enough. I'm going to find a way to think about myself as a member of my community, and I'm going to recognize that when I don't go to work tomorrow and all my colleagues are standing behind me and they're not buying anything from that company that I work for, or they're standing with me on the picket line, right, then that is my power. So what I lose in economic power is also what I gain in the power of the mass, right? And we don't have that mass movement thinking anymore the way we used to. And in many cases, it's because these incumbent structures, like unions, have eroded in our communities. In many cases, it's because these, sort of trajectories of how technology develops has alienated us from each other, right? But in any case, if we don't start thinking about this now, then we're just going to fall further and further behind. Before we were falling behind the barons of capital. Soon we'll be falling behind a robot or an algorithm, right? Something that is even more dehumanized and dehumanizing. So, and that's something to keep in mind. And so we can't just, getting back to the economic thinking model, we can't just think about aggregate growth in the economy, because increasingly that it's not even about that not filtering down into workers' wages. That's just not even translating into jobs. We're getting to a point where we're not going to have enough jobs for people to do, right? So what do we do then? I don't know. That's why this dialogue around universal basic income is coming up, right? Can we envision a world where we're not working to keep living? And then what would work look like? And that's a scary thing, but that's a precipice that we're all going to have to face sooner or later.
So I think I understand the point about not trying to falling into the language of this just being like an economic tool that we could leverage. And I sort of face this and go back and forth with, if I'm understanding correctly, a similar issue a lot. I'm very slowly working on an essay sort of looking at the case for open borders and no borders. And there are a number of different arguments you can make. And the one I'm personally most interested in is like the ethical, moral, philosophical, human one. And I agree, as a human being, that should be the one that we should sort of start with. But at the same time, like, not using the language of the world, or the way that the world works, I think, it's sort of like naively just putting our foot down and saying, like, okay, we're not going to engage in that way. But that, tragically, is how the world engages right now. And, you know, I think of an example, the Wall Street Journal in, I can't remember what year, 1984, around there, published an op-ed, and it was very short. It was, there should be, or something like that, a 5-word amendment to the Constitution, which would be, there shall be open borders. And that was because it was based on an economic model. And I think this is a debate we shouldn't wade into right now, but I think open borders would have a terrific effect, an uplifting effect on a lot of people who are undocumented or underdocumented right now. And if we can sort of get the hard right, or like the barons of capital, or the tech barons of capital, back on board to that, I think any language at all would be productive there.
I struggled with this a lot too, and just to quickly follow up, I mean, I agree with you. It's tough because you don't want to describe people's human value as like a widget in an economy, and so I think, you know, it's incumbent upon all of us as journalists to talk about immigrants' value as well as other people's value as humans and people who deserve to live and exist and strive. But there are people you're trying to convince, and it's important to also reach them, and the economic argument is one tool sometimes. So there's like a balance to be struck that I struggle with, but I think it's one we can't just throw out because it's unfortunately the only one that will ring with some people.
When you brought up wages for housework, and I think that was one place where the question really came up, right? You know, in theory, we could raise this question: should stay-at-home moms, or people who are parenting full-time, right? Do they deserve wages? In theory, they're doing work that has an economic value, right? Do we want all of our parents and spouses to be on some sort of payroll system? I don't know that that's the sustainable solution when you get down to the brass tacks of it, right? But on the other hand, just raising that question is really important because it raises questions about where do we draw the line between how we value ourselves as economic actors and how do we value ourselves as caring human beings that we're connected to beyond, hopefully, if I shared an umbilical cord with a person, I'd want to think of them as more than just, someone who provides me with the service every day, right? That's the question that is raised, right? Where we want to take that question is a matter of calibrating, how much we want this material money, right, capital, to be what our lives revolve around. And this is a particularly important question when we're getting to the point where maybe some people, they're just going to be perhaps a day when not everyone, perhaps we're already reaching that point where not everyone can be a full-time worker and making a living wage in the way that work is structured. It doesn't have to be that way, perhaps, and there should be ways that we can maybe push back against that in the name of protection and stability, obviously. But we need to start thinking about what our priorities are, right? Is our priority to get an 8-hour day, or is it to get a 3-hour day, right? Where did the 8-hour day come from? Where did the weekend come from? What about a 4-day weekend, right? So those are all things that we can turn the equation around of economic thinking so that it does become a conversation about human rights and civil rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the encouraging things that has happened in the political conversation on the left recently, and this does sometimes intersect with basic income, it doesn't have to, is that what we're after in getting more money or any of the material stuff that we're typically after is more freedom. Like if you work all day, if you work 2 shifts, you don't know when you're going to be home, you don't know when you can take care of your kid or your family or participate in local politics, you have no freedom, you have no life. Like work is eating away at life. And I think that frequently when you describe that to people, everybody recognizes that. And everybody recognizes the need to put value back on all of that other stuff, which is sort of like the stuff that makes us human, as opposed to the stuff that runs us into the ground. I don't know if we fully addressed the question about talking about perhaps our enemies instead of the victims of capitalism. At The Nation, the columnist Alexander Coburn, who is no longer with us, but when he was alive, he used to take the interns out for lunch when they started each term and ask them, "Is your hatred pure?" And as a committed Marxist, he knew exactly who he was talking about when he asked that question. And I actually think that keeping in mind that while we're committed to thinking systemically, there are specific antagonists is helpful. And actually, I have a friend who likes to point out that during the election, something that was productive that Bernie Sanders did was he would name the various barons of industry and the people who are making pharmaceuticals that are killing us, and you can talk specifically about the Mercers and the Koch brothers and so forth, and that's actually a productive thing to do. It focuses your energy. I guess with that, actually, we are at time, and folks will hang a little bit to chat. I think, Michelle, I'm going to turn the mic over, but I really want to thank our panelists who are incredible, and I learn from every time. So
thank you. Thank you so much for coming. You've given us a lot to think about in the next day and a half of the conference. We do have time for a break, which is important. We've been sitting here for an hour and a half. I do want to make the announcement. Yeah, I do want to make the announcement that upstairs in room 304, we have break. We have light refreshments. So we're hoping the 4 of you could join us for that. We have a book exhibit as well, but let's use this time, this half an hour, to really talk and get to know them. Thank you so much. Thank you.